all of you for joining us today. My name is Courtney Doagu. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CG in the International Law Research Program. My research streams are intellectual property law and emerging technologies, technology and law. So within that is artificial intelligence and questions about data and the intersection of all of those. It's an honor to be your moderator today, and I'd like to invite all of our panelists up to the stage. So if we could begin with all of our panelists introducing themselves and why they're here.
Yeah, should we start?
Sure.
Yeah, excellent. So my name is Donna Litt. I am co-creator of a technology company here in town that has built an AI to help employees be more autonomous and be more productive. And I suspect that's why I'm here today, to be able to speak to that.
Great, thank you.
My name is Ryan Jenkins. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at California Polytechnic State University in beautiful San Luis Obispo. And I study the ethics of emerging technologies and the ethics of military technology. So some of my areas of research include cyber warfare, autonomous weapons, autonomous vehicles, and my interest in autonomy has broadened generally to studying questions in AI and algorithms and the algorithmic distribution of benefits and burdens more recently.
Great, thank you. And Maura.
I'm Maura Grossman. I'm a little bit of an unusual beast. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I'm a lawyer by training. I've worked both in public and private sectors, but since June 2016, I've been a research professor in the Department of School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo. I teach one of the only courses in North America that brings together law students and computer science graduate students to study AI, law, ethics, and policy.
Great, thank you very much. So in order to frame our discussion today, I'd like to invite all of our panelists to take a few minutes to explain from their unique perspectives what we mean by the ethical, social, and legal impacts of artificial intelligence, both positive and negative.
All right, sitting in the hot seat.
Yeah.
First off, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. It's truly humbling to be sitting here with you folks and speaking alongside. I have no doubt that I will learn just as much from you as everybody else in the audience, so thank you for that opportunity. It's definitely a big deal for me. In any case, I spent a long time kind of noodling on the best way to answer this question because as a technologist, there's definitely some table stakes. Just as we develop our technology, we need to be thinking about the data sets that we're using and making sure that they're not unintentionally biased, that the decisions and the recommendations that our technology make are explainable and are traceable. There's transparency there. And then ultimately, as a technology provider, as a service provider, we have to make sure that we're delivering on our commitments to our customers. And that extends everywhere from making sure that we're responding to their queries in time, but really, most importantly, that we're handling their data, we're storing their data, we're treating their data in line with the commitments that we made, both contractually as well as spiritually, and what we stand for. And so the reason I spent so long thinking about this particular question is because no matter how many times you enumerate all of those really great data points and areas for us to focus on, what this conversation, for me anyway, is really about, it comes down to humans doing things to other humans, doing things to other humans, humans making decisions for other humans, and humans, in the worst circumstances, taking decisions away from other humans, and doing that at scale, in a lot of cases without consent and without knowledge of what's happening or what the long-term implications could be. And so I love to hear a lot about what our other panelists here are saying today, because that's the reason that those questions matter is because you get into the realm of if it's really about what humans are doing to other humans, the questions then become what should humans be able to do to other humans and what should they not be able to do? And then globally, which is a very difficult thing to answer, what do we want to be able to do to other people? And that becomes incredibly difficult when we think about the diversity of culture, and everybody's definition of ethics is a little bit different, and it's very culturally defined. And even within, two individuals, my own household growing up, Eastern philosophies, Western philosophies colliding over the dinner table, there's lots of differences as it relates to just policy and how these decisions can be made. So I'm really interested in those nuances, and for me, the conversation and why this is so important is because that's ultimately what it's about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great. You might be in the hot seat, but you've done a very good job of setting the framework and the foundation for what I'll say, so I appreciate it. You've said a lot of things that I wanted to say before I got to say them. So one of the things that you reminded me of was this quote by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis says that what we call man's power over nature is really man's power over other people with nature as its instrument. And technology, we know, has good and bad effects. And in the words of one of the philosophers of technology that I study and I teach in my class, it has good and bad effects at the same time and in virtue of each other. So there are certain aspects of technology that when we investigate them closely, we find that they're responsible for both the good effects of technology and the bad effects. This makes disentangling the good effects from the bad effects extremely vexing and challenging. But as with any new technology, the challenge is also always to capitalize on the good effects while trying to anticipate and minimize and compartmentalize the bad effects. So how do we do that with something like artificial intelligence? Well, what are the benefits that artificial intelligence gives us? Well, it can make decisions, make very impressive judgments at lightning speed. It can comb through reams of data that no human being or team of humans could ever have the time or the resources to look through. And it can detect patterns that human beings wouldn't be able to detect. Now, each of those benefits also has a drawback. So the fact that it can make judgments in lightning speed means there's little time to second-guess them or audit them or analyze them after the fact, which is, of course, going to be a necessary component of deploying AI in ways that are just. The fact that it can go through reams of data that humans couldn't go through invites us to collect and encourages us to collect more and more data more and more voraciously, while nurturing the impression that more data is always better. And this is going to cause or encourage people to collect data that some people might not want collected about them. Finally, the fact that AI is able to reveal patterns that human beings would not detect, or think about problems in ways that human beings wouldn't be able to think about them, also raises the problem that Donna pointed to of explainability and transparency. So the fact that AI approaches a problem or can come to a conclusion in a way that's different from the way that a human would think about it raises the question of whether we'll really be able to understand why it does the things that it does. Now, I think that we're going to talk about transparency and explainability a little bit more, but in my mind, that's one of the most serious questions that AI confronts us with, is how willing are we going to be as a society to turn over control of our lives to systems that we often don't understand, can't explain or investigate or audit? And when these decisions concern things like our rights, this is a recipe for injustice, and it's a recipe for very, very serious concerns. I think the reason why it's so important to think about these questions early on is because once these technologies are released into the world, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. It's extraordinarily difficult to uninvent technologies. The example I give my students is to think about nuclear weapons. After World War II, nuclear weapons proliferated until there were something like 60 or 70,000 of them in the world. And it's taken one of the most concerted, widespread efforts of political organization in the history of humanity just to get the world to stop producing nuclear weapons, even after the world was threatened by the nightmare of mutually assured destruction for several decades. We see the same thing happening with climate change. In the face of increasingly dire warnings by climate scientists, and in the face of the largest coordinated protests and demonstrations that have ever taken place in the world, we still find the nations of the world are reluctant to uninvent or to wean themselves off of this technology after its benefits have become clear and after its use has become ingrained in society, in our habits, in our capital investments, and so on. So if there's any choice, if there's any hope of crafting these technologies so that they become tools for good rather than tools for evil, we have to do that before they're invented, before they're deployed, I should say, before they're released into the world.
Great, thank you. And Mara?
So perhaps my foray into this area is a little bit less philosophical than my two colleagues. So here I come in 2016, and I'm this bit of a fish out of water in this. I'm sort of a social scientist in a hard computer science department. And I find in my classes, the computer science students, they're brilliant, but they don't see this stuff that we're talking about as their issue. Their job is to optimize the algorithm, to make it more efficient. They're not concerned with where the data came from and whether it's clean or biased because somebody gave it to them. They're just supposed to build the best, most efficient algorithm that predicts accurately. And what's done with it, they don't really see as their problem either. And I also teach at Osgood Hall Law School, and I've taught law other places. And if you're a social scientist or if you're a lawyer, you'll understand that there's this piece in your brain that reacts to math like spiders, like, and so the lawyers don't understand the technology, but they're supposed to be the ones who come up with the policy and the regulations for technology they don't understand. They don't know the questions to ask. And so both of them think it's not their problem. And I'm sitting there saying, well, these algorithms are going to be used on vulnerable people who don't have a voice, who I'm not worried about the doctors and lawyers who can lobby. I'm worried about the poor and the minorities who have no voice, nobody to speak to them, and here the people in power and in the best position to do something don't see it as their role. And we have to have them own this, and we have to help them see this is their problem too, because if it isn't their problem, it's nobody's problem, and that scares me.
Thank you for that. Maura, we're going to stay with you. As a practical example, one major concern that we've been hearing a lot about over the recent years is the challenge and dangers of bias. So what do we mean by bias in this context of artificial intelligence, and where do we see it arise from algorithms, data, research, and what challenges do you foresee?
So bias comes up in several different contexts. There can be bias, and these tend not to be well distinguished. There's bias in data, there's bias in algorithms, and then there's bias in the humans who develop the algorithms, who collect the data, and who interpret the data. And I'll give you some examples, and it's not always so easy to parse all of those. So let's talk primarily about bias in data. So I want to develop a tool, and I want to identify potential employees who are going to be very successful at Fox News or at Breitbart or someplace like that. So I have to define success, and I define success as 5 years with the organization and at least 2 promotions. And so it doesn't take race or age or anything impermissible into account. And I apply my algorithm, and lo and behold, my algorithm tells me that conservative white men will satisfy this criteria, and that's what it goes out and finds for me. So that's primarily bias in the data. Let's talk about bias in the algorithm. So I don't know if you're familiar, there was an article in 2016 in ProPublica, which is an online journal, about a tool called Compass that's used to make predictions about recidivism when people are arrested, whether they should be given bail, whether they should be put on parole, how long their sentences should be. And the article accused Compass, and it's a proprietary algorithm, so it's not made public, it can't be challenged. And let's think of a couple of facts. So in the US, blacks and whites smoke pot at equal rates, but blacks are 5 times more likely to be arrested for either carrying or using pot. So if your data includes arrest for drug possession as a criteria, we've already got a problem because one group is arrested 5 times more likely than the other. And there are 2 types of errors that an algorithm can make. One is called a false positive, and one is called a false negative. So a false positive is saying you're pregnant or you have cancer when you don't. And a false negative is saying you're not pregnant or you don't have cancer when you do. And those aren't always created equal. Often one error can be worse than the other. So when they're not evenly distributed, as they weren't with this tool, what it turns out was when it over-predicts recidivism, it was always blacks who were over-predicted. And when it under-predicted and let somebody go free, who shouldn't have, it under-predicted in the whites. So the blacks were bearing the brunt of the false positives, and the whites were getting the benefit of the false negative. And that's a bias in an algorithm because it was distributing those positives and negatives unequally. Now, the other problem we have is it's not entirely clear what we mean for an algorithm to be fair. And we would disagree on that in this room, because does that mean everybody should be treated equally? Does that mean we make up for systematic biases of the past, so we put our finger on the scale on that algorithm and give the benefit of the doubt to a certain group? Does it mean addressing the cause of the injustice? And it is not entirely clear how you clean the data of this, because even if you remove race or gender from the data, there are other variables that are highly correlated. So zip code and race are often very, very highly correlated. So if you have somebody's address in the data, you don't need race because it's going to be pretty obvious. And if there's anything about a maternity leave, that's going to be a pretty clear indicator of gender. And usually when there's a gap in somebody's resume, it's either because of a psychiatric hospitalization or a maternity leave. So a gap in a resume is probably going to either indicate woman or crazy. And it isn't clear how we fix this problem. So that's the bias problem, and it's actually many problems all wrapped up in one.
Thank you for that. And related to that question is the question that we're going to come back to about explainability and transparency and black boxes. Ryan, could you explain to the audience what we mean by those terms?
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to some of the things that you said, Maura, because they're really excellent, and they're really important for us to consider and for us to take seriously. So I've had conversations with people who work in STEM, and one of the frustrations that we encounter in discussions about algorithms is that they have a veneer of objectivity. But you mentioned some examples that Kathy O'Neill talks about in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction. And I think it's a quote that comes from that book where she says, there's no such thing as raw data. There's only cooked data. And that might not be true when you're talking about measuring someone's height or their weight or other factors that are uncontroversially objective. But even something that seems like it would be objective, like data about where crimes are committed in a community, can reflect human biases, just like the ones that you pointed out. So I've had conversations with people in STEM who have said, look, the data are objective. Either you committed a crime or you didn't. What's wrong with judging you on the basis of these other factors that would predict whether you're going to recidivate, whether you're going to commit a crime again? And I said, well, some of these factors might be problematic. I mean, they take into account, for example, where you grew up, the crime rate of the neighborhood in which you grew up. And he said, oh, wait a minute. They're judging you based on where you were born? Well, that's something outside of your control. Do we really think that it's fair for a person to be punished on the basis of something that's entirely outside of their control? And just bringing up that single thing. So Compass, I think, takes into account something like 150 factors. One of them is the neighborhood you grew up in and the crime rate thereof. And talking to my colleague, talking to my friend that works at the same company that I do, this technology company, so he works in the engineering side of things, and bringing that up to him was enough to show him that there are serious questions about the kind of data that we choose to integrate. And just pointing out that some data seem to be off limits, that it's wrong to judge someone on the basis of things that are outside of their control, or it's wrong to structure a person's opportunities and determine a person's opportunities and what their future will look like based on things that are outside of their control. It's enough, I think, to point out that the way that these systems are constructed often conflicts with other things that we hold as very important. So in this case, we have a pre-existing moral conviction about the reasons, the kinds of reasons when it's permissible to punish a person and the kinds of reasons that it's not permissible to punish a person for. Race is an obvious candidate for the kind of thing that it's not permissible to punish a person for. Compass, that program that demonstrated a very clear racial bias, oddly enough, it doesn't take race into account. And this was part of their defense. They said, look, it'd be one thing if the survey that the convicts fill out asked them their race, but as a matter of fact, it doesn't. So our algorithm's not racist. That was their defense, even though it does take into account other factors, like you said, that are very clearly correlated with race. So what kinds of questions does this raise for us? Well, it's a very serious question for us that we ought to be entitled to understand why these decisions are being made. And this is where transparency and explainability come into account. If this is something like why Netflix is recommending particular shows to you, it doesn't seem hugely problematic, even if Netflix always gets it wrong. Netflix often gets it wrong for me. I'm often mystified at the things that Netflix recommends that I watch. But look, this problem doesn't raise questions of justice. But other uses of algorithms that very seriously impact my opportunities, my economic opportunities, my social opportunities, the kinds of things that I'm going to be punished for, those do raise questions of justice, and we see algorithms increasingly creeping in to those kinds of applications. So the recidivism rate is one that's gotten a lot of attention, I think, because it's the most clearly troubling, one of the most clearly troubling examples that we know of. Here we're determining what people go to prison and what people are set free on the basis of data that we often don't understand and can't really audit. And that's hugely problematic. It's not only problematic to punish a person longer than they ought to be punished, that's an injustice to them, but it's also a huge mistake to punish someone too little, to give someone a sentence that's too little, because then you're letting someone back out on the streets that should be in jail. So that's a threat to the public safety as well. So hugely, hugely troubling questions that come up here. The question of HR or applications that screen job applications and so on is also troubling for similar reasons. So one of the things that Cathy O'Neill says in that book is that algorithms automate the status quo. And what this means is that you should only be comfortable feeding an algorithm troves of data and letting it come to conclusions if you're satisfied that the status quo is already just. And in a lot of these cases, policing is a clear example, hiring is a clear example. The status quo is almost certainly unjust. There are ways that we can improve on the justice of the status quo. Now, all of that is a preamble to what your question actually was. So in America, we have the principle, it's in our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, that says that you have the right to confront your accuser. And I think this is why, for example, you can call someone to the stand and cross-examine them on the stand if you've been accused of something in a court of law. And I think that this legal principle rests on a deeper moral conviction that we have. And the moral conviction that we have is that you're entitled to understand and you're entitled to interrogate the reasons that are appealed to shape the opportunities that you have in your life. This is clearest in the justice system. You're entitled to understand. You're entitled to examine the evidence that determines whether you're going to be sent to prison. Because, first of all, it seems like the evidence could be mistaken, the evidence could be faulty, we don't want to risk convicting a person mistakenly. And secondly, it's quite plausibly an affront to your dignity as a human being to have you put away for reasons that you're never told. And that's quite offensive, I think a lot of people would find. So that deeper moral conviction is at play here when we start talking about algorithms that we don't understand and we can't audit. There's a lot of work that's gone into explainable AI, and that work is quite promising, and it's better late than never.
And I think that the challenges, the technical challenges around explainable AI are tremendous, so they shouldn't be undersold. But we're seeing some promising developments made in that direction now, and I think that's reason for us to be optimistic.
Great, and we'll come back to, if we have time at the end, about the interplay between IP and
Absolutely.
explainability. So we turn to you now, Donna. Donna, can you explain how you use artificial intelligence at Kite, and whether you've considered, whether you've had to confront considerations of ethical, social, or legal challenges in your company's use of the technology, and how you've approached them?
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly we're not playing in quite the same space as you've spoken to, but we're contributing to an ecosystem, and so absolutely, it's a part of the conversation. So as mentioned, we built an AI that helps make employees more productive, more autonomous, and really for us it's incredibly important to be as transparent with our algorithms as possible and make sure that from a hiring and talent perspective, what we're doing is we're hiring with inclusive practices to ensure that our employees are not only very skilled in what they do and they're sensitive to these topics and they understand, but also so that we have a diverse outcome so that the people who are actually working on our technologies, working on handling the data sets, thinking about our customers and putting them first, are representative of the actual customer base that we're serving. And that's critically important for us, so we've absolutely taken that into account. And I think really the primary driver for us in being able to tackle all of these issues comes back down to, as fluffy as it might sound, empathy. And it's empathy for a number of different reasons and in a number of different cases. The reason why we care about holding ourselves accountable to higher than average security standards, to data privacy, and making sure that we care about the storage is because we care about the customers. We care about making sure that they're safe, that they can uphold their commitments to their customers, and there's that kind of follow-through, waterfall effect. And we focus on that every day with our team, and it's baked into our values, it's baked into the language that we use, it's baked into our processes, and certainly it's something that we commit time to, and it's never perfect, because we're all humans and we're all trying to figure each other out, but the more time we focus on figuring out communication, transparent communications in the workplace, the more time we spend trying to develop meaningful connections within each other, the more well prepared we'll be to deliver technologies that help people in a holistic way. So I think there's some key learnings there that we've taken away from and operationalized as it relates to connecting with each other, with our customers, so that it can translate into best technology delivery. Now, I think perhaps the best way to communicate how we think about things in our company is really through an example. So for me personally, it's learning a lot about AI technologies, explainability, and the challenges there, but also the bias and everything along those lines. I think the biggest learning for me has been around the ecosystem and our role in the ecosystem. And so not only are we a vendor where we provide a technology to others in the world, we are also buyers. We buy technology. And with our cents and dollars, we can make statements. We can support technologies that behave a certain way, and we can choose not to support other technologies that behave a certain way. And I think it's been, as the head of operations, as the person who looks at all the different vendors who we do align with and choose to support or invest in, it's something that's critically important to think about. So to help ground that in example, we use a contact database. Our sales reps want to make sure that they are tapping the right titles in the workplace, the right people in the workplace, that the contact information that we're using to reach out to them is up to date. And in order for us to use a contact database, we had to decide which contact database we wanted to use. So there was a bit of a procurement process. We're a really young company. Our procurement process is about as lightweight as it gets. But ultimately, we came down to 2 vendor options. And vendor 1 has this way of getting contact information that's very analog. It's bums in seats in an office. They call into those offices and they verify that the data is up to date, accurate, and then they update the database that then propagates so that everybody who's using that database can then get the most current information. Super cool, it's super analog. That's how they do it. It's good quality data and it's done by humans. Vendor 2 has a very clever approach, a very clever and scalable approach, whereby they have a free product offering that anybody can access, and then they have a paid service. The free product offering is available for anybody who signs up, and it gives them access to the database. And in exchange, the person who signs up agrees to have their contacts be a part of the database through email exchange. And that was really interesting to me because when I first heard about this technology, it was really exciting because, again, it's scalable, it's clever, it kind of fits that startup model. You know, you kind of want to do what's leading edge. But then in digging deeper and finding out, you know, well, where do you guys get your contact information? How do you keep it up to date? And following that thread, realizing that these users who sign up for that, you know, one-time use free product are grad students looking to get contact information of a professor, or they're recruiters looking to get contact information of a particular candidate. They're not thinking about their mom who's emailing them. They're not thinking about their aunt, their uncle, their grandparents who are emailing them at that same inbox, whose email address and title information is now available to this contact database. And yes, it's GDPR compliant. Yes, there's kind of the legal protections are in place too, but the spirit in which they're obtaining that data means something. And in learning that and discovering that, it was an easy choice. Vendor 2 did not make the cut, vendor 1 did. And that's because we had the ability to go and make that decision. And I think that is where, looking forward, we're going to continue to make the most gains, and that's in who we choose to align with, the types of vendors, the types of customers that we choose to service or not service, because that is where a more scalable impact can actually be made.
Thank you. That's an excellent example, an excellent tangible example. And so this section was basically context setting for kind of the core of where our discussion is going to go. And to set that up, we realize that we're interacting with AI, well, whether we know it or not. We're seeing self-driving vehicles on our streets. We're hearing about the development of autonomous weapons, and major tech companies are bidding on AI projects at the Pentagon. We're developing predictive algorithms that are designed to intentionally identify individuals with mental health and other health issues for the private sector, and designing medical diagnosis systems to be more useful, efficient, but to help with the bottom line. So how can we make sure as a society that we're developing AI for good, where ethical, social, and legal considerations are integrated into every aspect of development, from conception and design to deployment, rather than waiting until after these technologies have been launched? And more specifically, getting to the core of this, is what is the role of educational institutions? What role does early education, secondary or post-secondary formation play in this? And I open this and a series of sub-questions that I'll ask next to the panel. So feel free to jump in.
That's the million-dollar question. Right?
Go ahead.
That's a hard question. I think that's the question for our time. And I would point directly. I guess I'll just be brief if Maury has something to say. I think that there has to be a significant role for educational institutions. That already there's a portion of accreditation for engineering programs. For example, the ABET accreditation requires that engineering programs have some sort of ethics component, but that covers that's a vague requirement, and a lot of schools fulfill that requirement in ways that are relatively insignificant. And so I think that if as a society, one very brief thing that I'll say, if as a society we're going to stress the creation of a new generation of engineers and STEM students, but at the same time we're starting to become increasingly worried about the ethics and the social implications of the things that they're applying their skills to, then it seems like there has to be a co-equal component of their education that places an emphasis on ethical thinking and projecting the consequences of what they design out into society. And I can say more about that, but Maura, I think you had something you wanted to say.
So about a year ago, I heard David Lipovsky, who's a visiting professor at Osgood Hall, speak. He's coming to Waterloo also in the new year, so I'm very excited to sponsor that. He's visually impaired, and he does, if you Google him, you can find these videos he does online where he walks through these award-winning buildings with his, stick, and he shows you just what an absolute disaster these award-winning buildings are for somebody who's visually impaired. So, like having a beam in the center of the hall, and things that most of us don't think about any day. And I recall hearing him at Osgood Hall, and it blew my mind, because I hadn't thought about the fact that, and he talks about how unsuccessful retrofitting buildings is for the disabled, and it occurred to me, we're going to have the same thing with algorithms. We're going to retrofit them to fit all these disabled people, because the disabled people are the outliers, and most of these algorithms are tuned to sort of deal with the normal or the average. And this can't be an afterthought. We cannot leave this as an afterthought and try to clean it up like we've cleaned up buildings for the disabled. This has to be done prospectively, and I'm very passionate about the education part, and I know you'll ask me about that, but I think we have to deal with this, not reactive, but proactive.
Proactively. Thank you. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit of color. I mean, you folks are much better suited, I think, to provide the informed perspective. I struggle a little bit with the role of the institution, specifically as it relates to educating folks, because the minute I think about the role of the institution, I think of the role of the parents, and we, as parents, are relying more and more on these institutions. I mean, maybe at some point it was about the spirit of getting education to everybody, but now it's the institutions themselves are a huge personality in the conversation. And so I struggle a little bit, because parents aren't necessarily in the position to be able to speak to a lot of these topics. And so whereas in the past, perhaps it was out of desire to rely on the institutions for education, now there's also necessity. And so if anything, the institutions are becoming that much more required to have this conversation, to drive this conversation. But as you can see, it's a challenging one.
Oh, absolutely. And so in your opinion, should there be a greater responsibility imposed on post-secondary institutions or specific faculties, for example? Like we've been hearing about a lot going on in law and ethics, and or do you see this as a ground up, like a grassroots endeavor that we've been actually seeing here?
I think one of the challenges in the way we do education now, it's so specialized and compartmentalized. I can tell you just from my own challenges of trying to get these two schools together. We don't have a law school here, so I couldn't do it here. I had to, and Reading Week is completely different at the two schools. So I have to figure out, what am I going to do on the week where one is meeting and the other isn't? They don't start the semester the same day. They don't end the semester the same day. I mean, these are small challenges. Then you get into the politics of my department, my budget, and at Waterloo there's engineering, optimization is a department, math, computer, and they're all separate. It's impossible to find out what else is going on campus, who else is interested in what you're interested in. But this has to be interdisciplinary. This is not going to be a problem that one discipline can solve. And yet the way our institutions are set up and the way our courses are set up, we don't have it structured for interdisciplinary thinking from different perspectives. And the scientists sort of look at the social stuff as sort of like soft and icky and feminine, if you will. We're going to have to break that mold and start thinking about education in a different way if this is going to be successful. And part of the challenge is often the students who are extremely bright in STEM are not necessarily the people who are taking social science or psychology courses. Maybe they are if they're interested. And the psych students, again, don't want to take that really hard math stuff that's really scary. And if we don't have people who can do both, it's going to be a disaster, in my view. Yeah.
Oh, agreed.
I think it's people in the sciences might say that the liberal arts are not just soft, but that they're not real sciences.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I hear.
It's trying to be diplomatic.
Yeah. No. Yeah, that's the thing that I hear, and more than that, it's also the thing that I feel. And I and that's communicated to people in the humanities through a lot of different channels. And so I think that your question was, how do we do this? Is it a role for institutions? Is it a role for education? Is it grassroots? I think the answer is yes. The answer is all of the above. The way that we solve this problem, each of these solutions is not mutually exclusive. And if we're going to have the hopes of solving them, we have to fight the problem on every front that we can. So that involves a much larger role for institutions, and it involves institutions clearing a path and providing the support for exactly the kind of interdisciplinary work that you mentioned. At my home institution, for example, you can teach team-taught classes between faculty at different departments, and I found that exciting and encouraging and invigorating when I first learned of it, but then I realized that you get roughly half credit. You get half credit for teaching those team-taught classes, and I thought, well, surely it's more than 0.5 of the effort to teach a team-taught class, and yet you're only getting...
It may be 1.5 of the effort, because you have to deal with another human being.
Exactly. And then you're only getting 0.5 of the credit for it. And I thought, well, that seems like a misaligned institutional incentive or bureaucratic structure that seems nice on paper, but from the position of someone who's actually tasked with designing and teaching and collaborating on a class like that, it's very unappealing because we appreciate how much work it would be. Those are the kinds of changes that we need to make to the bureaucratic structures in education, I think, to clear the way for this kind of reaching across the aisle. I'll reiterate what I said earlier, which is that I think that engineering schools that see themselves as preparing the next generation of engineers should see themselves as preparing and creating the next generation of ethical engineers as well, or thoughtful engineers. There's a very deeply rooted misperception about the nature of science in a lot of, in Western society especially, that science is perfectly objective, that the algorithms are perfectly objective, data is perfectly objective, and if it's perfectly objective, it doesn't raise a lot of ethical problems. But the people in the humanities have been pounding their fists for at least 150 years to point out that there are subjective choices that go into the construction of these machines and technologies and so on. So I think it's important for that conversation to start being brought in early and often to STEM education. I think there's clearly also a role for companies, technology companies, and I think that they're starting to appreciate this, and I think they're starting to pick up the mantle for this mission. So Microsoft has a chief human rights officer, Google has an ethics board, they have in-house ethicists. These are some promising examples of technology companies that are starting to appreciate that there's not only a tremendous PR value to having positions like this that are filled and that are clearly operative and doing real work, but they also have a social responsibility to take these questions seriously, and they can demonstrate that they're serious about their social responsibility by doing more than paying lip service to these kinds of concerns. So after the Project Maven controversy, Google developed a set of AI principles, and that demonstrated that they're very serious about thinking about the ethics of the artificial intelligence systems that they create, how they can be implemented, what they want them to be used for, and so on. So I think that there's a lot of different things going on here. There's the kind of grassroots concern, which is the increasing amount of public pressure that we're seeing being put on Silicon Valley. And there's also, at the same time, a kind of moral insurrection that has gripped Silicon Valley, which is coming from the employees of the companies themselves that are saying, look, we need to get serious about this. People are walking out. Thousands of people are signing petitions. People are quitting their jobs in protest over what they see as a lack of seriousness about the implications of what companies are creating. So I think that you are starting to see the tables turn, and you're starting to see increased pressure from multiple directions, and you're starting to see the institutions that do have a lot of influence, educational institutions and the companies themselves, start to appreciate that and starting to change their own culture too.
Great, thank you. And Donna, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you for that. That was great. I guess the one comment that I'll make from the industry side is, I mentioned this before, our focus on inclusive hiring practices, and that means there's a lot of factors that go into that, but I think something that is worth noting is, as a part of that conversation with inclusion, it's how do we, and this is something that we do, is how do we look at people's skill sets outside of the norm. And so we have folks on our team who wouldn't necessarily, you'd earmark as, oh, yeah, you're absolutely going to be working in an AI company. Rather, you might expect them to work in sales, or you might expect them to continue in humanities, but instead they found themselves a home at our organization impacting change because they do bring that diverse perspective. And so in the private sector, in that world, there's absolutely a push to make sure that it's not just about different walks of life, different abilities, and all of that, but it's also bringing in the different educational perspectives, which is also one of the reasons why we are so interested in partnering with institutions or educational institutions to help build on research with the industry initiatives that we have going on. So that's something that we look at.
One other thought, and I think it goes to both points. Ethics is not something you can lecture somebody about in an hour or two to shove it in a first-year course. That's not how it works. It actually requires intense sort of focus in small groups and dialogue and the diversity you talked about. And that's very hard to do, to have those conversations. And I think not only do we have to have them at school, and what's useful about Waterloo is these co-ops. People actually go out on co-op and then come back, and then they say, you know, oh, yeah, I saw this happen. My employer had this thing, and it occurred to me, gee, maybe that's invading somebody's privacy. And I think if the companies also have to be receptive to have people who are receptive to hearing this thing. It isn't only the financial benefits, but there have to be ombuds people, or people have to feel safe raising some of these issues and concerns. And because it goes back to what I said at the beginning about ownership, you can only start talking about it if people feel it's safe to say, this is my issue and this bothers me. And so I think there's a piece for the companies and for school, but it's not just a lecture here to shove an hour into your course on AI ethics and tick off the box.
Thank you for that. And that goes to the next question, which we don't need to address because you already have, which is collaborating between institutions and how it's really important that everyone's speaking with one another. And it just doesn't belong to one. The onus isn't in one spot, and it's not about passing the buck. It's about really integrating it deliberately into everything that we're doing. And what I'll touch on, because you did mention the private sector, what's the role of government in this equation? Throw that out to anyone who wants to.
It's tough because there's the balancing of innovation on the one hand. Nobody wants to overregulate and be the one who's behind the eight ball with innovation. Some people have, and I think we also have to, like you said earlier, not all AI presents the same risk profile, and it shouldn't all be treated the same. We shouldn't put it all in the same basket, and I don't know if the answer is thinking about this by application or by sector. Maybe autonomous vehicles present different issues than recidivism and police prediction and so forth. I struggle with transparency and explainability. I think that's part of the story, but I think there are some technologies right now that we're just not capable of explaining, and frankly, there are little black boxes up here that we're not capable of explaining all that well either. Maybe we need something like an FDA for high-risk algorithms, not all algorithms, but, and Kathy O'Neill, who you mentioned, has a company called Orca, where she'll go in and independently audit and do a good housekeeping sort of audit of your algorithm to see if it's biased or fair, if it does what it's supposed to be, for its intended purpose, if it's reliable and so forth. And maybe we need some kind of certification, not for all algorithms, not for whether you get Netflix or not, but for the ones that have a huge impact on economic well-being, freedom, liberty, things like that, democracy.
Maybe we need a government or some kind of independent agency that will do that kind of auditing for us.
That's very interesting. And do you see it as a government only, or maybe a multi-stakeholder aligned with government type?
It may need to be multi-stakeholder because there may not be the proper expertise in the government at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much for that. Ryan, could you please explain the role of ethicists and philosophers and how they can contribute to many of the issues that we've been discussing today? How can they work together with stakeholders, including students, to be integrated into the design and development of artificial intelligence?
So the first thing that I want to say is just to add on to what Maura said a little bit, which is that I think that there are the role that the government could play is that, first of all, there seem to be some laws on the books that are just being inadequately enforced when it comes to the use of algorithms. So there are some applications of algorithms that seem like they're, if not violating the letter of the law, then violating the spirit of the law. And these are algorithms that might determine how jobs are advertised or how housing is advertised, say, for example, on Google and on Facebook, respectively. Both companies have gotten in trouble for the way that their advertisements are targeted. So, for example, on Facebook, you could post a housing ad and you could target it, you could remove certain races from seeing the housing ad. Well, that's explicitly against the law in America. It shouldn't be possible. So one of the things that could happen, one of the low-hanging fruit for government involvement here is just to make sure that the government is actually enforcing the laws that are already on the books when it comes to the use of algorithms. When that was pointed out, Facebook very quickly fixed the problem. They said it never should have been used that way in the first place, which is good. They were very responsive to that. But the fact that the problem existed in the first place is very troubling. So what's the role of philosophers? What's the role of ethicists? Well, I was saving this for my big finale. but I think that the most important thing for both philosophers and STEM to appreciate is that philosophers are not here to slap hands. We're not here to point fingers. We're not here to tell people that the way that they've been doing things is wrong. A colleague of mine who was asked a similar question, I was at an NSF-funded workshop about collaboration between the humanities and STEM. And he said when he's talking to, he's a philosopher of science, and he says when he's talking to his STEM colleagues, he says, look, engineers are people who by definition want to make the world better. So what's the role of philosophers? What's the role of ethicists? Well, philosophers are people who have been thinking very carefully and systematically for about 2,500 years about ways that you can make the world better and ways that you can make the world worse. And what we would humbly suggest is that there are ways of making the world better that engineers might overlook, and there are ways of making the world worse that they might neglect to consider. So the collaboration between philosophers and STEM, or ethicists and STEM, has to be exactly that. It has to be a partnership between equals. There was a lecture in, I think, 1952, C.P. Snow's lecture, The Two Cultures. And back then, Snow was a computer scientist, and he lamented at the time that there was so much tension and so much acrimony between the humanities and computer science. And he said, oh, computer scientists will sort of snicker at people in the humanities because they can't draw a circuitry diagram. And meanwhile, people in the English department will think that computer scientists are uncultured because they can't quote Shakespeare or something like that. And Snow was saying, we have to do better than this as a society. That was 66 years ago. So this is clearly an ongoing project. It's an ongoing struggle. But I think that the most important first steps that we can take are acknowledging that we have things that we can learn from each other. And this is something that Snow says in that book. Snow says, I only have half of the knowledge that you do. And you should also acknowledge you have half the knowledge that I do. But if we come together, we can fill in the gaps in each other's knowledge. We can better understand the challenges that you face and the way that you can move forward in a more ethically and more philosophically informed and careful way. There's a great model for this that's taken place
since the 60s or the 70s, and it's the model of bioethics. In the 60s and 70s, a lot of doctors became very, very concerned with the kinds of things that were going on in medicine, the kinds of studies that were being run, the kinds of things that were being done without patients' consent, and so on. And these things were getting published, and a lot of people weren't batting an eye at it. But some doctors and some philosophers also got very concerned, and they said, you're doing things that seem morally wrong. You're doing things that seem ethically mistaken. And so there grew a partnership between philosophers and ethicists and doctors, where you would literally have ethicists shadowing doctors as they went about their daily rounds and understanding the kinds of problems that doctors encountered, understanding the way that they thought through them, and then the philosophers might contribute a perspective or an argument, or why don't you think about it this way, or have you considered this objection, or what if someone were to say to you such and such, here's something you might not have thought about. And as a result of this collaboration, the field of bioethics blossomed, and it's a fantastic success story. And we have the principles of ethics that govern the way that doctors operate, and they're taught in every medical school. It's where we get principles of consent and autonomy and beneficence and non-maleficence. And every doctor that's educated, at least in America, every doctor that's educated is taught those principles early and often. And those principles arose from a close collaboration between philosophers and ethicists and doctors, so that both of them could understand the best way to present the ethical challenges and the best way to systematize frameworks for thinking about them and working through them that aren't burdensome. They're not supposed to hobble doctors and hamstring doctors as they go about their daily rounds. That's the last thing that we want to do. So we're not here to slap hands. We're here to try to help you think through the challenges that you face in order to make tools that bend the arc of history towards justice, rather than mistakenly encouraging or enabling injustice, which none of us want.
Great, thank you very much. And Maura, would you like to add to?
I'd just say, I think some of the components we need to, I think that we've all been talking about, to sort of sum them up, is sort of right-sizing the risk management. It's not one size fits all. It's going to be a very nuanced solution that's going to vary depending on the danger of the particular algorithm. I think getting the right stakeholders at the table, and that includes both diversity and interdisciplinary. And Cavoukian talks about privacy by design. This has to be by design, too. It has to be from the beginning going forward. It's not an afterthought. And I think it has to focus on validity and reliability. I don't really care when I get an airplane how lift works and all of that. I just want to know it lands safely where it's supposed to land, like 99.99% of the time. And this is a problem that we can solve. We have the resources to do it. We're just not, I guess because it seems so far off or so magical, we haven't done it yet. But like bioethics and other things, I think if we get the right people at the table and people's ear flaps, aren't down, and they start valuing what other people can bring to the conversation, we can make steps. Maybe won't be perfect, won't be overnight, but we can get there.
That's great. And Donna, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think I love kind of hearing that story. My background's in archaeology, and when I moved into startup land tech world, I was a little surprised and shocked at some of the gaps in the conversation, and so I've absolutely benefited from that synergy myself, so thank you for the story there. I think for us to get this right, it's really understanding the relationship between data and AI. I always think about AI as the top of the data food chain, because at the end of the day, we're only being able to do what we can do with AI because of the immense amount of data that we have, and knowing and always being cognizant of where that data comes from. It comes from people, and if people are providing that data, do they know what they're providing, and do they understand where it's going to go? And so I think for us to get it right, it's as individuals, we need to understand when we input our email address, our demographics, when we spit into a tube and we send it over to the other end of the world to get what our DNA print is, we understand what that actually means, because that's as much a part of me as my liver, my arm, my organs. And until I think people start to understand what data is and what it can mean to them as individuals, we're going to be fighting these kind of same battles. So I think that that's a critical component.
Great. And I noticed that we're a little over time right now, but that's also my fault in that we started a little later. So we'd like to open the floor to the audience. So if everyone can thank preliminarily our panelists for such a great... So we'd like to open the floor to the audience for questions. We ask that you please come down to either of the microphones at the base here. I know that all of your minds are buzzing with this information, but for the benefit of everyone and because of the limited time, we'd like to ask that you limit yourself to one question per person. And also, if you could just introduce yourself, your name and affiliation. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Sophie. I am a recent grad with a STEM degree. And I guess my question is for Ryan, but for the rest of the panel too, of how do you deal with the fact that sometimes the goals of the people who are making the algorithms are have the incentives are misaligned with necessarily having something more just. In that a lot of algorithms will be for the recidivism rate is about categorizing something. So it's and oftentimes you want algorithms that will categorize things quickly and efficiently. And so the people on the margins are more likely to be miscategorized. Or if a pharmaceutical company is doing research, they want to have positive results for their products. And so how can you deal with the fact that a lot of people developing the algorithms might have goals that are counter to having the most accurate and just algorithms?
That's great. And I think it's a serious problem. I used to study, this occurred to me a couple days ago. I used to study the martial art Aikido. And in Aikido, and I suspect in other martial arts, there are two general ways of responding to an attack. One is that you can redirect the energy of your opponent, and the other is that you can meet it directly. And I think that you can give those two kinds of responses to this problem. So one is you could try to redirect the energy. So let me do the other one first. You can try to meet the opponent directly, force on force, and you can say, what you're doing is unjust. It's wrong to do that. Here's some reasons why it's wrong. Here's some reasons why you should care, even if you don't care. One way that you might do that in this case is by trying to convince them that certain kinds of outputs actually have a more significant disvalue than other ones. So if you're just looking at the accuracy score and you say well, it's 98% accurate, you might say, well, it depends who that 2% is. And that 2% could actually be significantly bad if you're miscategorizing all and only people of a particular race or background. That would be a real problem. So you could try to meet force on force and say, you know what, you're doing the wrong thing and you ought to care, damn it. But that's not always a great response. So the other response is redirecting the force. And I think that the way that you do that is by saying, look, this is really bad for PR. If you think that you're doing something that's actually the best and most efficient, but you risk a real serious public backlash if this gets out, it's actually going to be bad for your bottom line. Now, I think in a lot of cases, I think in probably more cases than we appreciate, doing the right thing aligns with the bottom line. So I would give both responses to that, and I'd say, really, if you think about it carefully, this might be one of those cases where doing the right thing is also the profitable thing, and that's a very happy ending.
Great. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Paul. I have a question around marketing. So it seems like a lot of the data that's being used and collected is around improving marketing, so that finding the right people to market to and being more persuasive to them. So to what extent is 100% effective marketing ethical, in the sense that I can't really distinguish it from mind control? And if it is ethical, then what makes it ethical? If it's not ethical, then what can we do about it? Because it seems like there's a lot of companies that are moving more in that direction.
Great question. I heard the word ethical, so I infer that this is directed at me. So Here's what I think. This is a really challenging question, because you're right that very effective marketing or perfectly effective marketing might be indistinguishable from mind control. But some means of marketing seem exploitative. And philosophers use the term exploitative in particular ways, specific ways, technical ways. But I think people who are not philosophers either can also appreciate the concern that we have with exploitation. Here are two examples of that. One example is that a Facebook memo leaked a couple of years ago that showed that they were able to read someone's emotional states very well. They were able to infer their mental states, including whether they were sad or feeling unconfident or feeling down, and in Facebook's words, quote, needed a pick-me-up. And the fact that Facebook can detect when you're feeling down or when you're feeling depressed raises the specter of exploitation, because we do think that it's particularly worrisome to take advantage of some kinds of misfortunes that people have. We call that, if you're taking direct advantage of someone's misfortune, in this case their depression or their lack of confidence or their anxiety or something like that, we might think that you're being exploitative and you're being harmful. We might have the same worries about marketing alcohol. So most of the sales in alcohol are provided for by a small portion of buyers. I think it's something like 50% of sales are accounted for by about 10% of people. And this raises worries because you can market alcohol really well if you know that your customer is an alcoholic. Is that morally problematic? It seems like you're exploiting an unfortunate characteristic of this person in order to make money. And that's where we start to get worried. The other example I was thinking of is that there was an NPR story this year about advertisers that can use location-based advertising to target people inside of emergency rooms. And the idea was you would target them for, say, personal injury law or who knows what other kinds of things, only to people who have just suffered some serious accident. Again, that seems exploitative. So most marketing is probably does not have this problem. But if you're taking advantage of people's misfortune, that's when it raises ethical red flags.
Maura, would you like to contribute
I'll
to that?
come at it in a slightly different way. We have a real problem. We have not, as a society, figured out the balance between privacy and convenience. And if you, and sometimes the splits generationally. So I want my privacy. I'd prefer not to get that coupon. Or I don't want that ad that, you know, when I've done a Google search for flooring or something, I don't want a million ads on flooring after that. It's not anybody's business. But there are lots of people who want that coupon, who want to get off a bus and be told that their friends are at a bar nearby. And we haven't figured that out. So that's one issue, is how much, you know, when you go onto these free sites, there's no such thing as free lunch. You're the product. Your data is the product. And that's why you're getting these services for free, because somebody wants your data. So that's one aspect of it. The other that concerns me is the better these things get at targeting us and figuring out exactly what we believe and what we want, the less diversity, the less we'll be exposed to anything different than what we already know, what we already expect. And to me, that's very, very, very dangerous, to only be fed exactly what somebody thinks I want, because maybe if I was exposed to something else, I might actually want something that's completely opposite of what I was thinking I wanted for dinner or whatever it was. And people find that all the time, that some of these dating sites and whatever that will find you your perfect match. Well, the person you end up with is nothing like what you wrote down, you know, that you thought you wanted. So it's scary. This concept of 100% marketing, I think, is to us, to get it perfect, is going to hurt us as a society, because we will just our thinking will get narrower and narrower.
Agreed. And Donna, would you like to contribute to that?
I mean, I don't have anything nearly so eloquent to add. I would just suggest that you don't always click don't always click. Go through all of your privacy settings for any of the applications that you use. If there's an option to receive ads but not receive targeted ads, opt in. And be intelligent about your personal use over technologies, and if there is, if Google's suggesting that you finish a sentence in the way that they think you're going to finish a sentence, maybe finish it differently. Just switch up your behaviors and think about your interactions with the technology. And I say it facetiously, but I think ultimately, as the consumer, you need to take ownership over those decisions as well.
That's a very important point. Thank you very much.
Gordon Cormack, University of Waterloo School of Computer Science. I wanted to follow up on a rhetorical comment that Ryan made about imposing ethics on educational institutions. I wonder what would happen in my department if somebody said, you must all teach ballet. I have no inclination and no talent in ballet, and the cohort has none either. Closer to home, we have had a history requirement imposed on us by a certification body. And I actually love history, and so I like to extemporize about the history of computing. And, the most frequent response I get is this on the exam? So how do you actually get a requirement like this adopted into a culture that very strongly resists it from both the teaching and cohort point of view?
Is this about ballet or about ethics? You petition your dean for a tenure-track line in ballet. So I think that there's actually an opportunity here for you to distinguish yourself as being leaders in this space. And you don't have to do much work on the internet to point to other companies that have ran into this problem by failing to take ethics seriously. And you can say, we don't want to graduate engineers that will make these same mistakes. We want to graduate engineers that will be at the top of their field, not just in terms of computer science, but also in terms of thinking through the ethical, legal, and social implications of what they're creating. And I think that you have that sort of scare tactic ready-made for you just in the last couple of months. I appreciate that adding a new requirement, that it can take a lot of energy to work against that bureaucratic inertia to try to move an immovable object. But there are things that I know have been going on at my host institution, for example, hiring lecturers whose full-time job is just to teach a full ethics class, or partnering between computer science and philosophy to hire someone that has a joint appointment in both departments that will teach almost entirely within the computer science department, or almost entirely within philosophy, but teaching an ethics class that the computer scientists are comfortable with and sign off on. So you might find that there are opportunities not only to make the case that it's good for the university, it's an opportunity for the university to distinguish itself, but also there might be opportunities to spread around the burden, the fiscal burden and the time burden of, in this case, adding an entirely new class into the degree requirements for your students or something like that. So there might be ways to spread that burden around so that doesn't seem as daunting. You might be able to recruit allies in other departments who would be willing to work with you on a project like that.
Thank you. And Maura, did you want to add to that?
No, I was going to say just being in a department, it's challenging when half your colleagues don't value that. So that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
We have to get them to value it.
Yeah, I agree.
And Donna, for someone in the field who has graduated from an institution, looking back, how would it have been if this was integrated into your curriculum?
There was a comment that Maura made earlier on about how in humanities you run away from the scary maths, and absolutely there was an element of that. But we did have stats courses, and absolutely that's a huge component, especially with archaeological science, that stream. And I think that had there been more emphasis, I guess to take a step back, I loved those courses. I thought they were great. I thought they did a lot of great things for context. I think it pushed boundaries. I think Really, it came from the professors and how the language they used, the way they pitched it to the students, the way they tried to get buy-in, and really their passion and their appreciation for the synergy of the two spaces inspired students to get over some of those obstacles. And I think professors have the responsibility, but also the opportunity to be that role model and to adopt language that is inclusive and can set great standards for students so that they can change because they're young in their careers, they're there to change, they're there to grow and be challenged. So I absolutely think that's a real thing, and I had that, and so I'm very grateful for it because I have an appreciation for it. If I'd had more of it, my appreciation would probably be greater.
That's an excellent point. Thank you very much for that. Oh, yes.
Can I add a couple? I just want to add a couple more things that are even lower cost. So some of the things that we've done at our school to try to nurture a relationship between philosophy and computer science, we've co-sponsored speakers to bring in speakers. And then afterwards, the philosophers and computer scientists went out to dinner afterwards and talked about possibilities for collaboration. We've done lecture swaps, for example. So I'll go guest lecture to a class in computer science, and I'll bring in a computer scientist to talk to my ethics, science, and technology class that's taught through philosophy. I've done presentations to the Data Science Club and the White Hat Computer Science Club at school about the ethics of what they're doing. There are plenty of opportunities outside of that. For example, there's another project where students from the humanities and computer science partnered together to co-author a case study in the ethics of emerging technologies. So they wrote about Apple's secure enclave in this case, and they wrote about the ethics of doxing. Those are some of the students that I oversaw, and they got independent study credit for that. So these are all things that don't require creating a new class or hiring a new tenure stream line or even a new lecturer. There are lots of ways just to start that relationship small, let it be ongoing, and then try to generate the leverage and the support for something further down the line. It could take years, but these are all ways that you can start small.
Great, and unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. We're at the mark, and then closing remarks, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Tona. I'm an IT auditor. So I think I'm very, very fascinated by this whole presentation. And I think where I come from, the question rises from a risk management perspective. You can see that as you've been discussing, there's obviously different stakeholders and different risks that people identify as they implement a solution, or you look at it from a delivery perspective, the financial perspective, the reputational perspective, and obviously the social impact. How do you, or have you seen an example where an organization has started trying to embed these ethical behaviors into the different layers of the organization? Perhaps from a management point of view, from a project perspective, from a risk management perspective, an audit, and after all, and ultimately a board level.
Actually, maybe Donna, might you have examples from the field that you could...
Yeah, I hope so. Certainly I can speak to what we're trying to do as an organization, because it is really an attempt to do just that. And it's take ownership over our place in the ecosystem, take ownership over our own voices, and make sure that we're sharing them in venues like this at every opportunity that we get. And so we're really working toward emulating a world where we're thinking about it from, again, I mentioned before, a values perspective all the way down through implementing our algorithms and making sure that our training sets, we're doing our best to check our own biases, that the way we're handling customer data from one employee to the next, from one system to the next, is following the appropriate processes that we put in place to be able to ensure that we're respecting the privacies of the users, that everything is de-identified, that everything is being, again, handled to the point where we've committed to the customer that we're going to be doing it that way. And certainly we look at our own, in terms of who we learn from, we look at our own investors and the different organizations that they themselves have invested in. We've had the wonderful opportunity to partner with different capital organizations that have invested in AI companies before, so there's lessons learned that we can incorporate there. I don't think there is one company, one organization that I've seen who has done it all. I think the conversation is evolving. There's absolutely institutions, IEEE, which are spearheading a lot of these to try to bring codes of conduct, to try to help get people on the same page. But I have yet to see one that's done a stand-up smashing job, but we're all But what I do see is people trying, people moving in one direction, and people starting to have that conversation. And there's legislative changes which are helping with that to bring it to the forefront. Most recently, in a big way, GDPR hit a lot of people's radars, and you see organizations as young as ours thinking about that, and that's fantastic. We're only a year and a half in, and we're thinking about how we can design for this kind of future-minded approach. And I think we're seeing more of that, but I have yet to see an organization who's really nailed it.
That's great, and thank you for that. And do you have anything to add? We're good. Thank you very much for your questions. So on behalf of Communitech, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and the University of Waterloo, I'd like to thank our excellent panelists, Donna, Ryan, and Maura, for such a fascinating discussion today. And thank you to, thanks. And I'd also like to thank Rob and Katie, who turned this concern that they had from a conversation into a positive opportunity for all of us to be able to engage with this issue and to look for solutions. So this is a pressing issue and a timely topic for all of us involved, from academia to technology firms, from the government to civil society, but most importantly for all of us, because it's going to impact us in some way if it hasn't already. So we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all, so stay tuned. And a shameless CG plug. So CG hosts a number of events like this one, showcasing our research and collaborating with partners like the University of Waterloo and Communitech. So if you have an opportunity, please check out our website, cgonline.org, for more details. So thank you all.